In the winter of 1941, Madrid was a city suspended between war and neutrality, a fragile balancing act that made it one of the most important spy capitals of the Second World War. Few people today realize that, at the height of global conflict, Spain hosted one of the densest concentrations of Allied and Axis intelligence officers anywhere in Europe. In the dimly lit cafés along the Gran Via and the quiet corridors of the British Embassy on Calle Fernando el Santo, whispered conversations and coded exchanges shaped the invisible war that unfolded behind the front lines. It is here, in this labyrinth of espionage, that the mysterious figure known only as North Star first emerged. For MI6 operatives stationed in the British legation, the challenge was constant, sifting truth from a sea of deception. Spain may have been officially neutral, but General Francisco Franco's regime leaned cautiously toward the Axis, and German agents from the WWII maintained a sprawling presence in Madrid. MI6's Section D, responsible for sabotage and irregular warfare, struggled to maintain a foothold in a country where every movement was watched and every conversation risked being overheard. Into this climate of suspicion walked a man who introduced himself not by name but by information. Intelligence so precise, so timely, that even the most seasoned British officers took notice. The first contact was recorded in an MI6 field log dated December 18, 1941. According to the entry, the informant provided details about German courier routes transporting encrypted messages between Berlin and the WWII outpost in Madrid. What made his report remarkable was the level of specificity. Dates, vehicle descriptions, even the names of drivers. He speaks with the certainty of one who has walked the corridor himself, one officer noted. Yet no one could determine how the man had access to such knowledge, or why he seemed so willing to share it. To understand the stakes of this moment, we must recall the broader strategic landscape of 1941. Britain stood virtually alone in Western Europe. The United States had just entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, but its intelligence apparatus was still in its infancy. German U-boats stalked the Atlantic, threatening the lifeline that kept Britain supplied with ammunition, food, and fuel. Any advantage, no matter how small, was precious. So when North Star hinted at German sabotage plans targeting Allied shipping routes along the Portuguese coast, MI6 knew they could not afford to dismiss him. Yet with opportunity came risk. As the weeks passed, the British handlers assigned to North Star began to sense inconsistencies in his story. He never revealed his true name, never agreed to meet in the same location twice, and never accepted payment beyond minimal funds for operational needs. His accent, difficult to place, suggested a life spent crossing borders. He could be Spanish, Portuguese, or even South American, one agent recorded. He is a man who has worn many coats. Historical records from the period show that MI6 struggled internally with how to classify the informant. Was he a walk-in with genuine access? A German plant designed to mislead them? Or something more complex? A man attempting to navigate both sides of a brutal war in hopes of surviving whichever empire emerged victorious? The tension within MI6's Madrid station reflected the uncertainty of the war itself. Officers debated how much to trust him, whether to expand his role, and most importantly, whether they were being played. A revealing moment came in January 1942, when North Star delivered a piece of intelligence about German pressure on Franco to allow Wehrmacht units passage through the Pyrenees. The allegation was explosive. If true, it could signal a potential invasion route into Vichy-controlled territories or even a contingency plan to threaten Gibraltar. But Madrid was a city fueled by rumors, and MI6 needed verification. A field officer's diary entry captured their frustration. He gives us just enough to believe him, but never enough to be certain. The case of North Star teaches a modern lesson about intelligence work. Information is only as valuable as the trust between the source and the handler. In wartime, trust is a scarce commodity. MI6's officers operated under constant pressure, aware that a single misstep could compromise not just their mission but the lives of countless Allied soldiers whose fates depended on accurate intelligence. As winter turned to spring, MI6 faced a decision. North Star was becoming too useful to ignore, and too enigmatic to fully trust. The intelligence he provided continued to be accurate in key areas, Yet the shadows surrounding his identity grew longer. Behind closed doors, British intelligence debated whether they were cultivating a priceless asset or embracing a dangerous unknown. What none of them realized was that across the city, in another embassy, another group of Allied operatives was beginning to hear the same whispers about a man who moved effortlessly between German officers and Allied diplomats. His name, if it was a name at all, was starting to circulate beyond MI6's reach. And soon, the Americans would come calling. By early 1942, Madrid had become a crucible of competing Allied interests, and into this volatile mix stepped the newest and least experienced player in the intelligence game: the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. What many forget today is that the OSS was barely months old when its first agents arrived in Spain. Their presence was cautious at first. Washington understood the danger of operating in Franco's Spain, where German influence was entrenched and the Gestapo often operated with impunity. But the Americans, eager to carve out their own intelligence footprint, quickly began hearing rumors of an elusive informant already slipping through the cracks between empires. His codename, though not yet known to them, was North Star. The OSS Madrid station was run under diplomatic cover out of the U.S. Embassy on Calle Serrano, a building unassuming from the outside but brimming with analysts, code clerks, and field officers shuffling through an evolving network of Spanish contacts. The Americans were determined to break the stranglehold the WWII had on local information channels. Their special branch operatives, many of them former academics or businessmen drafted into intelligence work, monitored German activity in the capital, tracking supply shipments, mapping suspected safe houses, and intercepting courier traffic. Yet the city remained opaque. "Madrid is a hall of mirrors," one OSS captain wrote home. "Everyone knows something, and everyone lies about it." Into this environment arrived word of a man who appeared to move effortlessly among German officers and Spanish intermediaries. A contact from the Portuguese border whispered that an enigmatic figure was offering intelligence on troop movements near the Pyrenees. Then a diplomatic attaché reported a conversation overheard at the Ritz Hotel bar, where two German officers mentioned an informant who seemed to know more than he should. Slowly the Americans began to chart these clues, unaware that MI6 had already mapped the same constellation of whispers. The first OSS meeting with North Star was not intentional. In March 1942, an American operative, Lieutenant Daniel Hargreaves, was conducting a routine surveillance operation on a German wire transfer officer when he noticed a man leaving the same cafe moments after the target. The stranger's behavior was unusual. He paused briefly at the cafe window as if signaling to someone, then disappeared down a narrow alley. Hours later, an anonymous note was delivered to the embassy with precise details on German financial shipments to Lisbon. It was signed simply, "A friend of the Allies." Days later, another note arrived, this time with convoy departure times and naval escort rotations. The OSS began to suspect they had stumbled onto a source with extraordinary access. Yet with each new scrap of intelligence came new questions. Why was he providing this information? How was he obtaining it? And most troublingly, was he genuine, or was he playing them for fools? OSS analysts noted that some details he provided aligned closely with reports the British had already shared through official channels. Could he have access to MI6 material? Or was MI6 withholding something? When the Americans confronted their British counterparts, MI6 deflected. They claimed ignorance, insisting that any overlapping intelligence was mere coincidence. But in private, MI6 officers grew increasingly frustrated. Their guarded recruitment of North Star was beginning to unravel. One internal MI6 memo captured the tension. "The Americans are circling him like vultures. If they make direct contact, the integrity of our operation is compromised." Meanwhile, North Star continued feeding information to both sides, maintaining a delicate balance that kept him indispensable, but inscrutable. He delivered warnings about German plans to disrupt Allied shipping routes from Bordeaux. He described meetings between WWII officers and Spanish Falangist officials. He even provided sketch maps of covert German wireless stations hidden in rural estates north of Madrid. Each report increased Allied reliance on him, and each report deepened the mystery of his motives. A turning point came in late spring when OSS operatives noticed discrepancies in his timing. On 2 occasions, he delivered intelligence containing details that had not yet reached German desks, raising the possibility that he was providing the Allies with information before sharing altered versions with the Germans. But if that were true, it suggested something staggering: that North Star might be shaping the flow of intelligence for both sides, manipulating perceptions to serve an agenda no one could identify. His movements suggest he is playing a longer game, Lieutenant Hargreaves wrote in a May 1942 field report. He is neither ours nor theirs. He is something else entirely. The British, reading their own surveillance logs, reached eerily similar conclusions. The human stakes of this uncertainty grew sharper with every passing week. The Allies were planning major operations in North Africa, and any compromised intelligence could cost thousands of lives. The OSS was desperate to verify North Star's loyalties, yet every attempt to follow him ended in failure. He changed routes daily, used crowded markets to lose tails, and met contacts in places where surveillance was almost impossible. A blend of discipline and instinct shaped his tradecraft. He operated like someone trained, yet no Allied file contained his name. By mid-1942, both the OSS and MI6 found themselves dependent on a man they barely understood. The Americans wanted to pull him deeper into their orbit. The British wanted to protect their claim over him. And as the 2 Allied services maneuvered for influence within the same fragile network, one truth became inescapable: North Star was slipping beyond their control. Soon, his double reporting would blur the lines between truth and deception in ways neither the British nor the Americans could have imagined. And the fog around him was only beginning to thicken. In 1943, the intelligence war in Europe entered a new and dangerous phase, and nowhere was the fog of espionage thicker than in Madrid. While armies clashed in Tunisia, Sicily, and the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, quiet battles unfolded in embassy halls and smoky cafes. It was a year defined by deception, by ghosts in the wires and whispers on train platforms, and at the center of it all was the man both MI6 and the OSS could neither control nor fully understand. North Star continued to operate with an audacity that unsettled even veteran intelligence officers. What few realized at the time was that his actions would intersect with some of the most significant deception efforts of the entire war. The hook that year came in the form of a message typed on a German Enigma machine and intercepted by Allied cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park. It referenced a valuable informant in the Spanish theater, providing reliable updates on Allied shipping. While the message did not name him directly, its details aligned too closely with the agent both Allied services were already running. It was the first hard confirmation that North Star had the Abwehr's trust. This revelation was both promising and deeply alarming. If he had real access to German intelligence officers, then his capabilities were far greater than either MI6 or the OSS had assumed. But if he was funneling real Allied intelligence to Berlin, the consequences could be catastrophic. The struggle for the Allies was the impossibility of determining which North Star was real. One day he warned MI6 of increased German surveillance on Allied telegram traffic. Another day he provided the OSS with alleged details of Abwehr attempts to infiltrate Gibraltar's defense garrison. Yet just as frequently, his reports contradicted or obscured one another. "We are deciphering a man as much as we are deciphering his information," an MI6 liaison wrote in a February 1943 memorandum. Both services agreed on one thing: North Star's tradecraft was not that of an amateur. His movements were carefully rehearsed. His knowledge of counter-surveillance signals, shadow checks, pattern breaks, brush passes, was textbook perfect. Historical records from the period point to a fascinating possibility: that North Star may have been unofficially connected to the broader Allied deception network later associated with Operation Mincemeat. In the spring of 1943, British intelligence executed one of the most audacious deception operations in military history, planting forged invasion plans on a drowned corpse released off the Spanish coast. Although Spain ultimately returned some documents to Germany, British handlers in Madrid scrambled to control the diplomatic fallout. During this same window, North Star approached MI6 with information about heightened German interest in Allied plans for Sicily. The timing was precise. Too precise, Some argued later. Was he independently tracking German reactions to mincemeat? Or was he somehow involved in steering the Abwehr toward the false narrative Britain had so carefully constructed? One diary belonging to an MI6 case officer sheds light on the confusion. Dated April 1943, it reads, "He claims the Germans are repositioning observers in Algeciras, but his tone suggests he is withholding something. He speaks as though he has already read their reports." In hindsight, this hinted at a chilling possibility. North Star may have been manipulating both sides not merely to survive, but to shape the war's information terrain. Meanwhile, the OSS documented cases where he delivered disinformation to the Germans. In one instance, he provided an Abwehr handler with inflated troop numbers for Allied battalions preparing for North African operations. These figures later appeared in German intelligence summaries, numbers that greatly overestimated Allied strength. To the Americans, this suggested he might be deliberately feeding Berlin falsehoods. But the British noted a concerning detail. Mixed within the false numbers were fragments of genuine, highly sensitive convoy data. A dangerous pattern, Lieutenant Daniel Hargreaves warned. He offers Berlin a poison chalice, but at a price we cannot afford. By summer, the duality of his reporting created friction between MI6 and the OSS. Meetings between the two services grew sharper, each accusing the other of losing control of the agent. A British officer noted, "The Americans treat him as an asset ripe for harvesting. They do not understand that his loyalties cannot be won." The OSS countered, "The British cling to him like a relic. If he slips through their fingers, they will blame us." At the heart of this tension was a shared but unspoken fear. Neither side knew what North Star ultimately wanted. His motivations remained as opaque as his background. Every attempt at deeper vetting raised more questions. Stories that contradicted themselves, accents that shifted with each meeting, references to places he had supposedly lived but left no trace in. The larger insight was one that every intelligence service must eventually face. Sometimes the most valuable source is also the most dangerous. North Star had positioned himself at the intersection of truth and deception, a place from which he could influence the strategic assumptions of two global powers. And then, just as both services sought to tighten their grasp on him, something unexpected happened. A pattern emerged in his movements, a quiet but deliberate shift in his routines. He began meeting Germans more frequently, delivering reports with increasing urgency. MI6 surveillance teams noted his late-night visits to apartments known to be used as Abwehr listening posts. The OSS observed subtle changes in his demeanor, as though he were preparing for something neither side had anticipated. The stage was set for a deeper unraveling, one that would push the Allies to confront the stark reality that their enigmatic source might not be working for them at all. Or worse, that he might be working for both empires more effectively than either realized. By early 1944, the quiet, uneasy balance that had defined North Star's shadowy role in Madrid began to collapse. The city, long a sanctuary for spies seeking refuge from the kinetic violence of the front, was becoming increasingly volatile. German agents sensed the war turning against them. Allied operatives, emboldened by victories in North Africa and Italy, intensified their efforts to crack remaining Axis networks. And amid this tightening web of surveillance, North Star's movements became more erratic, more dangerous, and more revealing. What began as a subtle shift soon erupted into an international intelligence confrontation that few had anticipated. The hook came on a cold night in February 1944, when OSS radio intercept teams at a safe house near the Castellana picked up fragments of a coded transmission from a German relay station. The signal, heavily encrypted, mentioned a trusted intermediary, delivering authentic Allied convoy data. This detail immediately ignited alarm. The Americans had long suspected that North Star sometimes passed genuine information to the Abwehr. But this was different. These were naval movements, data so sensitive that even minor leaks could expose Atlantic convoy routes and cost hundreds of Allied sailors their lives. Lieutenant Daniel Hargreaves, who had tracked North Star for nearly 2 years, wrote in a report that night, "If he has breached naval traffic, the implications are severe. Either he is deeply embedded within German channels or he is no longer operating under Allied direction at all. For the OSS, the struggle was no longer academic. It was about determining whether their most enigmatic informant had crossed a line that endangered the broader war effort. Across the city, MI6 received similar concerns. A British surveillance officer shadowing North Star recorded seeing him enter an apartment linked to the German diplomat Ludwig Losacker, an individual known to liaise regularly with the Abwehr station chief, Paul Windsor. The apartment had long been under MI6 scrutiny. It served as a meeting site for mid-level German agents coordinating sabotage intelligence. When North Star emerged 40 minutes later, his demeanor was composed, but his tradecraft was uncharacteristically sloppy. He failed to conduct proper counter-surveillance checks, a detail that alarmed the British deeply. It was as though he wanted to be seen, the handler later noted. Insight came in early March when a partially decrypted German message reached the British embassy in Madrid. It referenced mixed intelligence from an asset whose dual obligations required careful handling. MI6 analysts immediately saw the implication. Berlin suspected North Star was double reporting. But they had not shut him down. Instead, the Germans were attempting to manage him, just as the Allies were. The revelation stunned MI6's Madrid station chief, who wrote in a classified memo, "He is not a double agent in the traditional sense. He is operating as a free agent, independently shaping the information space." For documentary historians, this is one of the most fascinating and troubling aspects of the North Star case. His behavior aligns more closely with the pattern of a triple source, an informant who creates, manipulates, and distributes intelligence on different levels to serve shifting goals. This was unprecedented for an asset working between the Allies and Germany with such consistency. The reveal came in April 1944, during a joint Allied attempt to verify the origins of the leaked convoy data. British naval intelligence officers discovered irregularities suggesting that the information North Star had allegedly passed to the Germans contained fragments of authentic convoy timings, but only fragments. Enough to be credible, not enough to be strategically crippling. It was disinformation, yet dangerously close to reality. The OSS argued this was proof he was intentionally playing a complex game, controlling the degree of truth reaching Berlin. MI6 countered that he was operating under their direction and that the Americans were misinterpreting the pattern. Behind closed doors, tensions between the two Allied services soared. MI6 accused the OSS of mishandling the asset, claiming the Americans were pushing him too aggressively for operational intelligence. The OSS fired back that the British were blinded by sentimentality toward a man they could no longer control. One internal OSS memo stated bluntly, "The British trust him because they must. We distrust him because we see what he has become." Meanwhile, North Star continued navigating Madrid with increasing urgency. His meetings with German officers grew more frequent, and his interactions with his British handlers became shorter, more pointed, almost restless. He began arriving with partial reports, details that hinted at larger truths he refused to share. When pressed, he deflected with vague assurances about stability and timing. He sounded like a man preparing for a storm only he could see. Insight into his state of mind comes from a rare first-hand account in a British field diary. He spoke with a tension I have not seen before. He said, "This city is closing in." When I asked what he meant, he simply smiled and said, "We all must choose when to disappear." The closing months of spring brought the Allied conflict with him to a breaking point. Both MI6 and the OSS knew they were losing control. Both feared the consequences. And as German networks in Spain began sensing their own collapse, one question loomed larger every day. Was North Star preparing to flee? Or was he preparing one final move? The answer would come soon, and it would pull the city of Madrid into one of the strangest intelligence vanishing acts of the entire war. By late 1944, the war in Europe was tilting irreversibly toward the Allies, and with each German defeat, Madrid's intelligence landscape began to crumble. The once confident Abwehr networks, which had operated freely under Franco's tacit approval, now moved with a sense of desperation. Their couriers traveled more cautiously, their meetings became shorter and more frequent, and reports of Gestapo pressure on German diplomats increased. In this climate of tightening fear, something extraordinary occurred. North Star vanished. The hook came on October 17, 1944. MI6 surveillance teams had been tracking an expected meeting between North Star and his British handler in a small tea house on Calle de Alcalá. He never appeared. For an agent known for impeccable punctuality, the absence was immediately alarming. MI6 operatives scoured the surrounding blocks, interviewing cafe staff and tracking known German vehicles in the area. Nothing. He had simply evaporated. No witnesses, no sightings, no clues. It was as if the man who once navigated Madrid with theatrical precision had chosen that day to dissolve into history. For the Allies, the struggle began instantly. The disappearance of an asset was not unusual in wartime espionage. Agents were captured, turned, or killed with tragic regularity. But the disappearance of North Star was different. There was no sign of struggle, no intercepted German reports celebrating a capture, no abrupt shift in the intelligence traffic he once influenced. Instead, his absence created a vacuum that soon exposed how deeply both MI6 and the OSS had become reliant on him. Within 48 hours, the OSS launched its own investigation. Lieutenant Daniel Hargreaves, now among the most experienced American officers in Madrid, coordinated teams to examine train stations, border checkpoints, and known smuggling routes into Portugal. They found a lead near Badajoz. A Portuguese customs guard claimed to have seen a man resembling North Star boarding a truck heading toward Elvas at dawn on October 18. When investigators examined local logs, however, the entry for that morning had been torn out of the ledger. The guard disappeared 3 days later. For Hargreaves, the implications were chilling. Either North Star had been smuggled out under German protection, or he had arranged the extraction himself with remarkable foresight. MI6's internal investigation, conducted simultaneously, followed a different path. British officers raided the apartment of a known WWII cutout on Calle Hortaliza. Hidden inside a loose brick in the fireplace, they discovered coded documents that appeared to contain copies of transmissions sent between Madrid and Berlin over the previous 3 months. Several bore a signature glyph, an angular mark resembling a compass arrow. It was the same mark North Star had used in earlier messages to the British. These documents were quickly transported to the embassy, where MI6 cryptanalysts spent days combing through them. What they found deepened the mystery. Among the encrypted messages were references to Asset S-12, a designation the British believed applied to North Star. But the content of these transmissions was baffling. Some contained genuine Allied disinformation, threads that aligned with known British deception initiatives. Others contained fragments of authentic Allied supply data or port traffic patterns, mixed with misleading numerical distortions. This raised a disturbing question. Was North Star feeding the Germans carefully curated intelligence even after MI6 believed he had severed contact? Or had the Germans been falsifying transmissions to manipulate the British perception of him? The most unsettling discovery came from a message dated just 10 days before his disappearance. It contained a directive from Berlin instructing the WWII station to preserve operational continuity with the intermediary even in the event of relocation. The word relocation struck MI6 like a cold blade. Had North Star negotiated an extraction with the Germans? Or were they anticipating a withdrawal as their networks collapsed? The reveal came 1 week later when Spanish police, under pressure from both Allied and German diplomats, raided the apartment of Paul Windsor, the notorious Gestapo liaison in Madrid. Windsor had fled the city just hours before. But his safe house yielded dozens of intelligence files, many hastily abandoned. In one of the binders, marked D Operations, officers found a partially burned document referencing a primary source in contact with both embassies. Again, no name, no signature. But one phrase stood intact: maintains independence as long as compensation is ensured. In modern intelligence analysis, this document has become one of the central puzzles of the North Star case. Was he being paid by the Germans? Was he playing both sides for financial security? Or was the phrase a deliberate German fabrication, an effort to mislead investigators and obscure their own failures. As historians have since noted, the timing of his disappearance is critical. By October 1944, the Wehrmacht was retreating from France. Paris had been liberated. German command structures were unraveling. The Abwehr itself was under increasing suspicion by the SS. In such a climate, even high-level German assets were no longer safe. If Northstar sensed this shift, and few doubted he would have, he may have chosen to vanish before the collapsing intelligence networks dragged him down with them. Yet one final detail remains, perhaps the most haunting. A week after the Windsor raid, a coded message was intercepted by Allied monitors in Lisbon. It was incomplete, heavily garbled, and addressed to an unknown recipient. But one line survived intact: the compass points inward. It was Northstar's calling card. Then nothing. Silence. As 1944 drew to a close, both MI6 and the OSS were forced to confront a stark reality. The man who may have shaped portions of the intelligence war in Spain had disappeared into the wreckage of collapsing empires. And yet, the story was not over. The aftermath, what the Allies learned, what they suspected, and what they could never prove, would only deepen the mystery. In the months after Germany's surrender in May 1945, as Europe stared into the ruins it had created, the Allied hunt for Northstar intensified. The guns had fallen silent, but the war within the archives, the interrogation rooms, and the tattered intelligence networks was just beginning. Few assets in the European theater had generated as many unanswered questions. Fewer still had evaporated so completely. What made Northstar's case extraordinary was that both MI6 and the OSS, now in the process of transforming into the Central Intelligence Agency, believed that resolving his fate might illuminate hidden chapters of WWII's shadow war. The hook came on June 11, 1945, when British officers recovered a cache of German documents from a former Abwehr safehouse in Hamburg. Among the papers were burned fragments referencing multiple intelligence operatives in Spain, including a file labeled Zwischenmann, the intermediary. Some fragments appeared to describe a relocation plan drafted during the final months of the war. Others listed falsified reports allegedly supplied by an unnamed source. The British immediately suspected a link to Northstar, but the documents were contradictory, incomplete, almost intentionally obscured. One MI6 archivist wrote later, "It was as if someone had edited history with a match." Meanwhile, the OSS took a different approach, interviewing captured German officers to trace any hint of Northstar's final activities. Paul Windsor, the Gestapo liaison who had fled Madrid in 1944, was captured in Austria and questioned extensively. Though evasive, he admitted that Berlin considered a certain Spanish-based informant valuable but unreliable. When pressed, he described the source as a man who brought truth wrapped in danger. But Windsor provided no name, no physical description, and, in classic fashion, claimed to remember nothing further. His statements raised more questions than they answered. The struggle to uncover Northstar's fate deepened as the Allies compared notes. MI6 analysts pointed to evidence suggesting he had retreated into Francoist Spain's interior, perhaps under the protection of sympathetic Spanish intelligence officers. The OSS countered with reports from Portugal hinting that he had been sighted near Porto, traveling under forged papers. A Portuguese dockworker even claimed to have spoken with a man matching his profile as he boarded a vessel bound for Brazil in late 1944. But when investigators questioned him months later, the man's story had changed. He now recalled the traveler as German, maybe Dutch. No consistency. No certainty. An important insight emerged from newly opened Spanish archives decades later. In the dusty records of the Dirección General de Seguridad, researchers found an unsigned memo dated November 1944. It referenced a foreign national sought by both embassies, who had passed northward toward the Pyrenees. The memo mentioned that the man had ties to Basque intermediaries known for smuggling Allied pilots across the border earlier in the war. But there was no name. No physical description. The document closed with a cryptic note, "He travels without allegiance." Some historians argue this is the closest contemporary Spanish reference to Northstar. Others believe it was part of broader misinformation designed to mislead both Allied and Axis researchers in the chaotic final months of the conflict. The reveal came when a retired MI6 officer, writing anonymously in the 1960s, suggested that the British may have secretly extracted North Star themselves. According to his account, never verified, MI6 feared that the OSS takeover and the post-war interrogation of German officers would expose the depth of British reliance on an unvetted, unpredictable source. The anonymous officer claimed that North Star was relocated to the United Kingdom under a new identity and placed beyond the reach of further inquiry. If true, it would explain the silence. But MI6 has never acknowledged such an extraction, and no files have ever surfaced corroborating it. The OSS, on the other hand, believed until the 1950s that North Star may have been recruited into Soviet intelligence networks during the geopolitical reshuffling that followed the war. This theory emerged from a Cold War-era CIA memo citing a Spanish-based double agent of uncertain loyalty, who resurfaced briefly in South America. Yet like so many leads in North Star's case, the evidence was circumstantial. The description fit half a dozen other wartime informants who fled Europe under assumed identities. Nothing definitive. A modern lesson emerges here. The greatest mysteries of intelligence work are often not the conspiracies, but the gaps, the silences left by people who made survival their craft. North Star was a man who thrived in ambiguity. His disappearance was not merely a vanishing act. It was the culmination of a life spent dancing between shadows. In the end, he may have been the only person who understood the full map of his loyalties. The story closes with a final haunting detail. In 1951, the British Embassy in Madrid received an unmarked envelope containing a small, weathered card. On it was drawn an angular symbol, a compass arrow pointing inward. No message. No signature. The envelope bore no fingerprints and no return address. Investigators traced the postmark to a small town in northern Spain, but beyond that, the trail dissolved. MI6 filed the symbol in the same folder that held the last known traces of the man they once called North Star. And with that, the trail ends, suspended between truth and rumor, history and disappearance. A man who played both empires, and in the end, perhaps belonged to neither.